Okay, let's get this thing going again. So, since we talked last time about sort of ADHD, at least we talked about the liver type. Why don't we just finish that conversation so it's complete? Um, I'll say, I was talking about the psychopath kid from the military family. He was genuinely a little. He put me on edge. He was a little. I don't want to say scary, but just a touch. He was not like he was old enough, but just the way he looked at me, kind of from under those heavy eyebrows. Kind of staring at me and stuff. But he actually, that whole thing, he ended up fine. He ended up great, actually. It was a situation where I had never and have not had to say it since, actually. I'd never said before to the parent. I was like, look, you're well within your rights to put this kid into some kind of foster care situation while you get sorted. Because, I mean, essentially, she didn't have any help from her family. Her husband, although ostensibly a nice person, just didn't grasp the gravity of the situation. He just didn't think his kid was capable of it. It was his kid. He knew who his kid was. His kid was frustrated and stuff like that. But the things that the mom was saying, like, look, I think he's hurting our daughter. The dad just couldn't wrap his head around that and just didn't believe her. He thought maybe she was being a little bit dramatic about it or something. Just kind of was pushing her off a bit, like, oh, well, I'm sure it's fine. But from her perspective, looking at her, I mean, she was scared of him. She was scared for her child. So I just said it. I was like, look, here's the number for Child Protective Services. And if you got to get this kid out of your house, I know it's going to put a major strain on your marriage. But for the safety of your younger child, you might have to think about this. And I'm sorry to have to say that. She said, thank you so much. You're the only person that said that. And, I probably needed to hear that. So I'll keep it open as an option. But the kid actually ended up turning out great. And she never had to do that. So what I did was I gave him a treatment in the clinic and then sent them home with herbs. And she came back after 2 weeks of taking herbs and said, actually, things are actually quite a bit better. It was a more dramatic change than I had expected from him. Uh, that she said, what's funny was just last night, I really felt like we had really turned a corner. And you know what did it? Was that she couldn't leave the daughter alone in the house ever. Right. So if she was cooking dinner, the kid had to be right next to her because she didn't want her wandering around the house with her brother. It's not a good situation. So the mom was very vigilant to keep the child close. And she was like, I was actually cooking dinner last night. And she says, and I just forgot to watch her. I'm usually just so on top of it. And, 5 minutes went by and I didn't even think of it. And then she kind of like jumped and kind of freaked out and she ran. And the kids were just in the next room, but they were quietly playing with Legos. And she was like, and things have just been improving for 2 weeks. And that was just kind of the thing for me, like kind of the capstone that like, I feel like we're really turned the corner here. He's kind of, he's kind of back to his normal self. Like he's not perfect. He's still irritable and frustrated, but his edge is gone. That edge that came when his father left is just kind of gone. He's not so combative and oppositional, and he doesn't have that meanness that he had. So I kept him on the herbs for another month and a half, maybe. And at the end of that, about a 2 month run of herbs, she was like, no, it's everything in the house is perfect. It's really back to normal. We're fine. We're fine. And then I caught up with her a while later, and she hadn't been taking the herbs after the 2 months. He hadn't been. And she said, no, everything's been good. And, so great, perfect. This was more than I could have expected. It was a much more dramatic change than I would have expected. I mean, if I give a kid a treatment and I send them home with herbs and they're taking their dose every day, my expectation is within 2 weeks, I expect to see measurable changes. Certainly. After a week, even a few days, a lot of the times. Now, what's harder for me to guess at, the timing is easy, but what's harder to guess at is how dramatic the change will be. Sometimes the change is very dramatic, like this case, darn near a miracle, for God's sakes. And then sometimes it's a bit slower process, but I still expect to see those changes within a certain period of time. Okay, so timing is easy for me to see now with experience, but the intensity, how dramatic that change is going to be much harder to guess at. So, basically what's going on here. So father leaves, the child's chi stagnates more because his only real lifeline, in a sense, relationship wise, with no other family around besides his stepmom, it stagnated his chi. And that's what we say in Chinese medicine. Any change has a tendency to stagnate the chi. That's why wood people have to be flexible. They have to learn to, all these things. And that's a sign of health for a wood person, is this, in fact, this flexibility, right? This ability to be flexible in their life. So when change comes, if they're not flexible, that puts a strain on that chi mechanism, that ability of the liver to keep the chi moving, right? So my suspicion here is, probably the kid was already chi stagnant. He was already a woody type. Then, he was already a pretty chi stagnant kid with the anger and frustration and irritability issues. Then on top of that, you add the father leaving for a long time. It's a big change for a kid, and it just got worse. And so, of course, then all of this much stronger livery behavior comes out. That's no surprise. I see that all the time. But the thing here, of course, that makes this story interesting is the sort of psychopathy aspect to this. The degree to which there was actual psychopathy is arguable, I suppose. But the fact that it was, in my mind, present is what makes this interesting. But why would they have this kind of coldness, this calculation, and then, sometimes it's this real strong output of very intense sort of livery behavior. The liver yang, or the liver fire, rises and comes out through the heart, and so then they get these big outbursts. But at other times, then for psychopaths, then it's a much calmer, measured kind of manipulation and lying and all those things, and kind of hard revenge and all of these things that they can really bide their time. And then there's the disconnection from their actions to their emotions. So it's a harder thing to think about. My suspicion probably is, normally the way we think about liver chi stagnation turning to heat is that heat gets into the heart, and once it gets into the heart, that's when it starts coming out. Okay, so here then maybe in psychopathy, for whatever reason, maybe the chi stagnation is so profound that rather than causing fire to rise and move into the heart and move outwards, maybe the chi stagnation affects the heart. And so it kind of blocks the Shen's ability. It kind of blocks their ability to feel their own emotions. There's some kind of separation occurs there. Because certainly with liver types, even, there can be a certain kind of callousness. It's pretty common for liver kids that, to sort of kill small animals or abuse small animals or something like that. I mean, it's an extreme version of this, but still even they're disconnected from their emotions around that. And for kids, of course, they're the systems, the amygdala, the emotional centers, and how that functions vis-a-vis the prefrontal cortex and these different areas of the body. And so this stuff is less clear in kids in the sense of having control and all these things. So maybe there's this, the emotional centers can get more easily subsumed in that situation because they're not even necessarily consciously aware of those emotions per se. So I don't know, but this is my suspicion probably. Rather than a heat reaction, this is more like a chi stagnation of the heart reaction. It'd be interesting in the case of, adult psychopathy. Remember in the first thing we ever outing that we had together was talking about chi stagnation of the chest. Right, so chi stagnation of the heart, palpitations, these sorts of things. Maybe these are present in these adults and you don't see it, or maybe it's present in the pulse, strong, wiry pulse through all the positions. These are questions in my mind, But another piece of this here that I think is interesting is this question of, we're always talking about the liver in terms of what can go wrong with it, right? So we're trained to see things from an algorithmic pathological perspective, just sort of, okay, if A, then, okay, what about this and this and this and this, creating a pattern diagnosis. But we're not necessarily trained in school on sort of the flip side of that, like what does the liver look like when it's healthy, right? So I sort of think about this a lot because I'm trying to, in my pediatrics practice, I'm trying to get parents to see their livery kids from the positive side so that they can sort of parent to their best qualities. So parent to their strengths, rather than always parenting to their weaknesses. The weaknesses being the quote unquote misbehavior, bad behavior, and they're always disciplining them. Well, that's sort of parenting to their weaknesses in a sec, always working on their weaknesses rather than sort of flipping that around and sort of modeling, so kind of parenting to their best qualities. And so when we think about what constitutes the best qualities in a wood kid or a wood adult, it's things like creativity. I really think that artistic creativity is not a heart thing. It's not a kidney thing. I think a lot of people think it's a kidney thing. I don't think so. I think the drive for creativity may come from the kidneys, but I think that the way that that creativity plays out really is the liver. It's the general. It's how the thing gets executed. It's so the creativity, of course, vision, so the ability to see into the future and to move towards that future. So then being able to move towards that future in with creativity, so thinking, problem solving behavior and that kind of thing, and then being able to be flexible, to be adaptable. Right. So this would be another. So we have creativity, vision, flexibility, adaptability. Right. So the ability to roll with changes. They're both strong and flexible, classic sort of wood descriptions. Right. So they can bend without breaking. I think a lot of this is emotional resilience. Adaptation, adaptability. Another big one for liver, of course, is decision making, assertiveness, especially with the gallbladder, sort of that sort of thing. So the ability to have in a sense, the courage and decisiveness to take a decision, to act on the plan that you have, right? But to use problem-solving behavior and adaptability to do it sort of correctly. And then the last positive quality I think that we see in wood is really, and maybe the best quality of wood is really like what I would think of as like benevolence or kindness. Right. That's what a harmonious wood person really loves is to be kind and to help others. That's like what all of those other things, creativity, problem solving, the vision, flexibility, all that stuff is in service to their basic sense of kindness, their desire to help others. Because remember, wood is nature, you know. So nature only exists in relation to other parts of nature, a tree and animals and all the little things, the interconnectedness of nature that's wood. Earth doesn't require any interaction. It just is, like the moon or something like that. It doesn't require any input in order to exist. But nature as a functional unit does. Nothing in nature can exist in a vacuum. So liver really strongly seeks interaction, but when they're healthy, they do it with benevolence and kindness with the idea of helping. Okay, so all those things are in service to helping others. So I think this is the healthy wood adults, the healthy wood kids that I know. They're always trying to be so helpful, almost to a fault sometimes. But like, I just needed a hug, and they're trying to figure out how to, how are we going to move forward? And it's like, I'm not ready for that. I just need a hug, So sometimes they little miss those things, but this is when you need it, it's great. So this is, I think, in a sense, this healthy liver. So anyways, that's me sort of finishing the thought. I just sort of do these off the cuff. So I was just sort of thinking out loud a lot of these, things. So that's sort of that. So the thinking. So switching gears now. So thinking about what we just talked about was these livery kids are in the classroom. Besides all the emotional stuff, they're fidgety. They're calling out answers. They're impulsive. All of these things that give them that classic ADHD diagnosis. Right, the hyperactive ADHD diagnosis. Liver kids are what you think of when you think of ADHD. They are that kid, right? Calling out answers, trying to be funny, no boundaries, bad boundaries, interrupting everybody all the time, and just trying to be the class clown. All of this as a way because they just want to enjoy the interactions. These kids are stoked, they're excited, and they just want to share that. So that's what's really going on with them. You'll really see in these kids that 99% of the stuff that they do that constitutes quote unquote bad behavior is really just them just being kind of excited, really excited, so it's kind of hard to blame them for that. But, there need to be boundaries, of course. Okay. That is in distinction to then what we call the inattentive type. Because in ADHD, there's basically two types. You have hyperactive types. They're distracted in the sense that they're fidgety and they're constantly looking at everything else and trying to talk to people. Whereas the inattentive type, they are distracted, but they're spaced out. The inattentive type is not hyperactive. They are both distracted types, but the inattentive type is spacing out. They're having trouble paying attention, but not because they're looking around, but because they're just staring off into space. They actually get what's called frontal lobe turnoff. The minute they actually need their brain to focus on something, it actually just kind of poops out on them. So it was working a little bit, but then it just goes away completely. Frontal lobe turnoff. This is the Dr. Amen thing, the guy up in Orange County here, who does all the SPECT imaging, the single photon emission computer tomography. This is the spleen type. Okay, this is the spleen chi deficiency type. All right, so this is the failure of the intellect, failure of the E, that aspect of the Shen related to the spleen. That clear yang of the spleen is failing to rise into the mind, right? So we talked about this a little while back with spleen chi deficiency, that whatever episode a while. So we sort of talked about this, right? The brain, the front of the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobe is just shutting off, so when they need it, it's not working. These kids are the ones who really do get the most benefit from Ritalin, because Ritalin acts on that part of the brain. Now, of course, it's not my preference to see kids on Ritalin, so instead we give them acupuncture and herbs to supplement qi, supplement the yang, things like gui pi tang, buzhang ichi tang, like standard sort of formulas, anything that has that warming, strengthening quality for the spleen, for the central jiao there. This is what's going to be useful. So you guys all know the standard points for that. Stomach 8 being very useful here. So kids who, these are more often girls than boys, typical, but I've certainly had my fair share of boys with this issue, but more typical girls. And also here, they're not really a behavior problem. So these kids tend to slide under the radar. They do well enough to get by, but they don't do well enough. They don't thrive. Right. So, and the things that they struggle with the most are like sort of subjects, first of all, academics, but subjects that are the most abstract, like math. There's no context for math typically, although that's sort of changed over time. I've noticed, even my kids with their math problems, it's a little different, but still, generally math doesn't have much of a context. It's really hard. These kids have a hard time with organization. So their rooms are a mess, and their homework is a mess. My teacher always called it pig pen syndrome. They would turn their homework in, and it's all dirty and stuff. So one aspect of spleen chi deficiency with this clear yang failing to rise in the mind is there's this organizational problem where they don't know how to start a problem. These spleen type adults, I'm not trying to be mean, but I call them the helicopter people in a sense, because if they have an interpersonal problem, they'll kind of hover around it and around it and around it and never address it. And I think a lot of that is that they just don't know where to start. That's just not how their brain works. Spleen types are really all about sympathy. And helping others with their kind of emotional states, like just being there for somebody, but problem solving, not necessarily their strong suit, right? Just from a personality perspective. Well, this is one place where this can really show itself is in academics, things that are relatively abstract. So you treat them. I like treating these kids because there's really there's not much emotional content here. It's really just a sort of a performance thing. So liver can be hard because there's so much emotional content. It really requires a quote unquote holistic approach. You gotta come at it with a number of different ways. Spleen type is pretty cut and dry. And I like treating these kids because they're going under the radar. They just sort of get by, but no, so I really want to treat these kids as much as possible, whatever age. I don't care if it's, 7, 8 years old, all the way up through high school or college or whatever. I like to catch these kids wherever they are because the treatment's easy and they just do so much better. So I like these kids. So spleen type ADHD is really the inattentive type. Okay, we do have another one, the kidney type, which is looks a lot like the liver type, actually, because it is a heat type. But here it's kidney yin deficiency, so it is a heat type, and the heat seems to, in some sense, get in the liver. So they are fidgety and hyperactive to a degree. They are, they can look very livery. They can look very livery. One tip off, of course, can be sleep if there's a lot of sleep issues, or things like getting hyper at the end of the day when their sort of daily quota of yin is depleted and they're getting hyper as the night wears on. They're just getting more and more kind of ramped up. Sort of that thing where haven't slept for 3 or 4 days and you're like, I'm going to go to sleep tonight. And then you just lay there and you can't sleep. That's kind of like a yin deficiency heat, making it a little hard to fall asleep. These kids, though, another differentiator for them is that they actually do really well unless they're sort of overstimulated. So if suddenly there's a lot of stimulation in their environment, that's where they tend to fall apart. Whereas the liver type sort of is the stimulator. They sort of are the ones doing the stimulation. They're the ones that are sort of volunteering themselves. Just kind of, liver kids are like, it's like a motor is just running all the time. So they're just constantly kind of making noise and moving around and stuff. Whereas the kidney kid is fine in school, academics, and paying attention, all this. They do just fine unless some number of factors create a lot of stimulation for them. So it's things like a warm classroom can actually be kind of tough for them because it's the heat is a little stimulating to their deficiency heat. There is if they're sitting next to a liver kid who's kind of bugging them. So these kids are very sensitive to environmental conditions. They get more amped up the more stimulus there is. So a really dynamic teacher who's kind of jumping around and doing kind of a lot of stuff, that's hard for them. It's hard for them to manage multiple input streams in a way. They like, for example, like timed tests. They would do fine on the test, but it's the aspect of the timed aspect of it. It's an extra level of input that they just don't seem to process that too well. And in fact, what you do see a lot with kidney type ADHD is sort of sensory processing stuff. Now, you're going to have to forgive me if I've already talked about this, but it's sort of something that I'm thinking about a lot, and this is a good example of this, which is that yin in your body is like, it keeps things quiet. It filters things, right? So I put on my clothes, I forget. I don't constantly feel my shirt rubbing on my neck. I put on a necklace. I don't feel it pulling on my neck. I put on, so all these little things. All the stimulus, my brain just forgets it. That's yin filtering out that stimulus for me. All the things that I see and all the things that I hear, and I just forget. I don't need that stuff rolling around in my brain. That's no fun. These kids have trouble forgetting this stuff. I think you see this in autism as well, that there's an underlying, under what's going on with autism, basically this insubstantial phlegm, there is this yin deficiency underneath that, typically. And so I think they have a hard time filtering stimulus, right? So I would often think of it this way, like when classes used to be in person, I'd be lecturing, and then the door would be open and there's a hallway and a couple of students are out in the hallway chatting, and it's filtering into the room. And there's kind of two kinds of students. One kind of student stands up, they go to close the door, but they glare at the people first, so that's like your liver type. It's like, this is not proper. This isn't how this is done. How could you be so irritating? And how could you, you broke the social rules. This is ridiculous. You're being ridiculous. And then glare at them and then go sit down and kind of slam the door a little bit. Make sure that they know that they did it wrong. Justice. Whereas like kidney types, they're more like the speech filtering in from the voices filtering in from the hallway is more like agitating them on the inside. So it could make them irritable, but it's more like they're having trouble suddenly paying attention. Teachers talking, they're paying attention, but that extra layer of stimulus, then suddenly it throws them off, throws the whole game off. And some you can imagine there's some brain element to this, maybe in the brain stem or something like this, where this area is being overstimulated by this area, by this stimulus. So this is the kidney type. It can look a lot like the liver type, except that when everything is set up kind of just right for them, they do great, no problem, right? You know, they're not. They typically lack a bit of stamina, so they get a little tired a little easily, stuff like that, right? So typical formula here, of course, is something like Tianwan Bushindan. Now, of course, we don't have like the heavy settling sort of mineral in there anymore, so you could think about how you might modify that depending, but this would be a typical formula. And, of course, everybody, you're already thinking of what about Zhibai Dihuangwan, and of course, all of these formulas are possible, right? Some way to clear this deficiency heat, right? Chai Hu Guizhi Ganjiang Tang, these kinds of formulas, right? Okay, you all know the standard, sort of points for clearing deficiency heat, et cetera, et cetera. It's fine. The last one is the heart type. The heart type is not really, in a sense, a type on its own. Typically, it's more a complication of the other types. It's when suddenly there's like a lot of emotional content. So for the liver type, then it's like a lot of outbursts and a lot of like, they're not just sensitive, they're really sensitive. It's a liver type who cries a lot and, that kind of stuff. The tears being the fluid of the heart. So anytime you see tears, the heart's involved. But suddenly there's a way higher level of just emotionality, in a sense, like it's almost irrational in some way. It's like, why, what? The parent is sort of flummoxed, or the teacher is sort of like bewildered by like, what happened here that requires this level of response? It's just like some kind of flip out, some kind of, just a meltdown. It's like, it just seems like a bit much, right? That's when the heart's involved, in a sense. You see this in the liver type. You could see this in the kidney type as well. In the kidney type, this looks typically a bit more like anxiety. Just a more generalized anxiety would be typical, and it gets worse the more tired they get. That would be pretty common. In spleen, heart involvement looks more like heart deficiency, more like shyness. So, that's classic Guipitang stuff, right? Swanzao-ren and Longyan rule. And so this is more heart deficiency, heart blood deficiency. This is shyness. So this is a kid who is just painfully shy on the playground. I mean, won't talk to anybody, just can't, really clingy, and will just sit by mom and will play by themselves, and they might want to play with other kids, but they are just so painfully shy. That's an anxiety thing, to the point of anxiety. And this is not just like, oh, the kid's a little shy sometimes and they kind of keep to themselves. It's like, no, this is not what keeping to yourself looks like. What we're talking about here is out and out anxiety, right? Okay. So this is then the heart type. Right. So this now is sort of how that works. Okay. So you have the liver type, which is commonest, sort of because they're a behavior problem. So they're getting reported a lot more. I don't know if I discussed this, but the way the Ritalin works on those kids, on the liver kids, because you're going to give a stimulant class of drugs, dexedrine and these things, to a kid who's already like, way too much energy. So you're putting energy into an energy system. It seems a little wild. How is this calming these kids down? Well, I finally got a pharmacist to break it down for me. Basically, what it does is it stimulates the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe has an inhibitory effect on the rest of the brain. So that's basically what's happening. It's not some magical paradoxical effect that sometimes doctors will describe. They're like, I don't really understand how it works. It's just paradoxical, but that's what it is. You get your hands on a pharmacist, and man, stuff that they know is amazing. So that's basically how it works. So the liver kids on Ritalin, yeah, it helps them to pay attention, but it's more like an edgy kind of thing. They don't. It's almost like, I feel like it's what it feels like to drink too much coffee. Now you know I'm a wood type because no earth type knows what drinking too much coffee is like. I drink a bowl of coffee every day. And I feel great, and the more I drink, the better. This is classic spleen stuff, you know. But wood types or kidney types, you drink too much coffee, it's no good. Crawling around in your skin, anxious. You know, your brain just kind of turns on you. You feel, you know, like you start having not positive thoughts about your own life or self or something. You know, that's typical what liver kids describe when they take Ritalin. That's how they describe that when they talk about side effects. I don't like myself. I don't like how I feel in my skin, in my body, you know, kind of crawling around really. So they can pay attention, but it's kind of this, I can just sort of sit here and pay attention. You can't see me, but I'm like clenching my face and my fists and stuff. You know, they're sort of sitting there. They can just sort of pay attention. So not ideal, right? And it's just further taking up their blood and it's not helping, right? So, so, anyways, I think that might be all I have to say about that. I'll probably think of a bunch of stuff and then we'll do another one. All right, you guys. So take it easy. I love you all and we'll talk soon. Okay, bye.